All right, so it's just gone 7 o'clock. People seem to still be filtering in, so let's give them another moment and then we will get started. I'm happy that you're all here on the correct night. Those who can't make it tonight, I suppose, can get us on catch up. Right. Hope some of you have some nice plans for Candlemas tomorrow. I certainly do. All right, so that's quite a lot of folks. So let's get started. All right. So tonight we are going to talk about Thomas Becket, Henry II, and what has historically been seen as a conflict between a church party on one hand and the state on the other hand. But to just frame this conversation in the way that they would have understood it at the time, let me start with a little reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle Jesus in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples, saying, Master, we know that thou art true and teachest the way of God in truth. Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, or no? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But what is God's? And what, for that matter, is Caesar's? So as with all of the parables in the New Testament, a facile interpretation of Jesus's words, that there are some things which are obviously God's and some things which are obviously Caesar's, and that duty or virtue is a simple matter of rendering the proper legalistic duty to each. That idea falls down on any sort of closer observation. So as with all of Jesus's parables, I think that you'll find that it's just a bit more complicated than that. And so is our story this evening. Just as an aside, for a start, I mean, Jesus himself lived in a time and place where incense was offered to glorify living emperors who had declared themselves to be divine. So the distinction between what was due to God and what was due to Caesar wasn't even that sort of cut and dried when Jesus first said it. And I think it only got more complicated from there. So there's something both in that parable, but also in the story or the history that we're talking about tonight that goes beyond the sort of easy, unthinking thing that we would like to do with it, which is sort of what you would expect with God. It's also what you expect with history, really. So tonight we're going to be talking about the real world implications of this parable, a conflict, or is there a conflict between the loyalties of Christians to God and to Caesar? So this conflict obviously ended in death, spoiler alert, ended in death for one Archbishop of Canterbury, but I would argue that it's defined much of English history since. So from Thomas Becket to the break with Rome, to the Elizabethan settlement, to the Civil War, to modern debates about the continued presence of bishops in the House of Lords. It is a history and a struggle that has sometimes been bloody. Hopefully it's not now, but it's a struggle that continues to be with us, or a debate that continues to be with us. So it's important to remember in all of this, though, we often talk about Thomas Becket and his sort of conflict with Henry II as though this was a conflict that was unique to England. The controversy between the powers of the church and the powers of the state, it's something unique to us. It's not. You have to see this in the wider context of what is going on in Europe at the time. So a sort of Whig historical framework sees Thomas Becket as standing athwart a sort of natural progress or development of the rule of law. So we say that this comes from the constitutions of Clarendon, the Magna Carta, to the Bill of Rights, etc. There's a beautiful sort of natural progressive development of the rule of law in England, and Becket doesn't want that. Becket wants to exempt a class of persons from being brought to justice for their crimes. He wants unequal laws for differing groups and social classes. He wants to exempt the clergy from their due punishment for crimes they're committing. Well, is that actually what he wants? Now, it's very obvious to us that, if you just look at the news today, that we do not like the idea of one rule for one set of people and another rule for another set of people. We hate that. If there's anything that we hate as a society, it's that. And so people who have seen Becket in a negative light have often seen it through the lens of, well, he just wanted the criminous clerks to go scot-free. Is this what Becket is trying to do? There are some problems with this interpretation. And indeed, there is a huge problem with the interpretation of the struggle between Becket and the king as one of crown versus church, or even as crown versus pope, as it's often betrayed. You're going to see, I hope, by the end of this hour, that it's simply, rather more complicated than that. So to understand where the story comes from, or where this controversy comes from, we need to lay a bit of groundwork. So first, the groundwork for the church. So the period between, say, the late 9th century and the mid 11th century was not a great time for the papacy. So there was extensive corruption. It's fascinating history. There's a succession of murders, power plays, the children of popes being placed on the papal throne. Popes are being appointed by Roman barons as sort of puppet rulers. And it's great. I guess my favorite, but yet least favorite pope is a guy called Benedict IX, who holds the world record for having been pope the most times. He was pope 3 times. Why was he pope 3 times? Well, because he sold the papacy. He literally sold the office of the papacy to, raise money. So this was not a good look. The papacy was not in a good place, and reform is obviously needed. So this sort of period of corruption and just some horrific stuff. Say it ended, most people place the ending of this in 1046, when the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III interferes in the papal matters, basically in order to depose 3 rival popes. There's 3 popes at this point. The Holy Roman Emperor says, "What are you doing?" He deposes all of them and gets a new pope elected in the place. Now, why was Henry involved? Well, the Holy Roman Emperors had been involved for quite a while. Anyone who knows about the investiture controversy realizes that there was a dispute between the popes or the papacy and the secular arm, so the Holy Roman Emperor, about who would get to appoint bishops within the Holy Roman Empire. The emperors, of course, said it's our job or our ability to do this, and the popes, of course, said that it was theirs. And this was a time of literal warfare between the armies of the Pope and the armies of the Holy Roman Empire. So England is not the only place where this conflict takes place, and we don't even get the worst of it. So this sort of period was ended, or at least brought to a bit of a standstill, by a series of reforms. They're often called the Gregorian Reforms after the Pope Gregory VII, although he didn't become Pope until 1073. So calling them the Gregorian Reforms is a slight misnomer. So in 1059, for example, the papal election decree established the College of Cardinals to choose popes, which is the way that it's done now. So that sort of institution is, basically about 1,000 years old and comes in during this time. There were also, canon law was being amended to, to have laws against simony, which is the sale of ecclesiastical offices, lay investiture, which is a problem. So the popes come down and say, nope, the lay people are not going to be able to invest bishops anymore. And also, one of the most controversial things is that clerical marriage is not allowed anymore, where before it had been, you could argue in some times and in some places it was quite common, but it was now declared to be against canon law. So this was not yet a magisterial papacy. The papacy of Gregory VII was not yet magisterial papacy, although he was trying to centralize power into the hands of the papacy. But it's important to realize that this was not universally popular across the church. And in fact, the people with whom it was least popular were the bishops of whom the Pope was depriving them of their power, essentially. So the bishops were not happy with the Bishop of Rome centralizing power in Rome or arrogating powers to himself that they themselves have had. So when you think of, a struggle between a church and a king, well, what kind of church? What kind of papacy? It's not yet the magisterial papacy of the later Middle Ages. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Now the stage machinery is in place, but it's important background against which to understand the struggle as it took place in England. All right, so let's talk about the Dramatis Personae in England. Who was this King Henry II that argued with Becket? So Henry was the son of a former Holy Roman Empress. So Matilda, Henry's mother, was the daughter of Henry I. Matilda had been sent off when very young to marry the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. They had a childless marriage, and so her son Henry, who became Henry II of England, was by her second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. Now, Matilda is a very interesting person, and I do sort of recommend looking up a biography of her. She's fascinating. Now, she was the heir to the throne of England. Why? Well, because her elder brother, and indeed most of her other siblings, and indeed most of the flower of the chivalry and nobility of England had all died in one disaster in 1120. There was a sort of drunken boating accident. Everybody was on holiday in France. They had this big, new, beautiful ship, the White Ship. And they decided, you know what? We're going to do the smartest thing. We're going to get roaring drunk. We're going to get the sailors roaring drunk, and we're going to sail across the channel at night. They barely got out of the harbor before they hit a shoal, and everybody, bar 2 people on that ship, died, including the heir to the throne of England. So Henry only has Matilda left, basically, after this boating accident, and he makes his barons swear fealty to Matilda. This is 1120. You let me know if a bunch of English barons like swearing fealty to a woman. Of course they don't. So when Henry I dies, Matilda's cousin Stephen declares that he is king instead. Some people aligned behind Matilda, some aligned behind Stephen, but actually the majority of the barons stayed neutral through what ended up being an 18-year-long war. This was a really destructive war of attrition. You had a lot of number of castles were built in England after the Norman Conquest. These were sort of largely impregnable based on the siege equipment and military technology of the time. So what you ended up having is, sieges where an army would encamp outside a castle and basically try to starve to death everyone inside until they capitulated. You have a lot of those sieges, not so many pitched battles. The conflict was considered particularly destructive, even by the standards of medieval warfare. And this sort of phrase, Christ and his saints slept during this period comes out of a contemporary chronicle. Victorian historians call this the anarchy, although this is kind of a misnomer. Because yes, there was a Matilda faction, and yes, there was a Stephen faction, but because most of the barons stayed neutral, they were sort of stuck up mightily at their ease on their own lands. And, they arrogated a great deal of power to themselves during this time. Eventually, both sides realized, look, we are not going to be able to resolve this conflict. And after a great deal of sort of machinations, they finally come to an agreement, the two sides, whereby Stephen will remain king for his lifetime and Matilda's son, Henry, will become king on Stephen's death. So this is what happens. This is how Henry becomes king. He becomes king at a relatively young age, and he goes through the country like a rocket. He decides that he is going to build himself an empire, and that is precisely what he does. He has the Queen of France, the very famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, divorce her husband, Louis, and marry him instead, which is how he gets Gascony and Aquitaine. And by various sort of conquest, negotiation, shrewd machinations, he ends up becoming what, if you remember the movie The Lion in Winter, you remember when Henry has a sword sort of poised over the head of Richard the Lionheart, and he's going to kill him. And Henry says, I, Henry, King of the English, Lord of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, Count of Anjou, Brittany, Poitou, Normandy, Maine, Gascony, and Aquitaine, sentence you to death. All of those territories that he is talking about, bar the ones that he got through his marriage to Eleanor, and of course the county of Anjou, which had been his father's, were basically annexed to this empire, this continent and island spanning empire, by right of conquest. He was a force of nature. Becket was no less of a force of nature, although he came from a completely different background. He was the son of a merchant of London. His father, Gilbert, was a mercer. Becket's essentially a local boy made good. Everybody, throughout his lifetime, when he's a child, people see how bright and intelligent he is. Through a bunch of things I won't talk about in the interest of time, he ends up in the household of Theobald of Bec, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, who gets Becket an education, a very good education by the standards of the time. And so when Henry II comes to the throne, Theobald talks with Henry and said, look, I have a young protege. You're looking out for a chancellor. Why don't you put Becket in, and Becket will be sort of your man, our joint man. So Henry II installs Becket as chancellor, and this is around 1155, I think. So Becket does become Henry's man. He acts for him for 10 years, basically, very loyally, sort of being his bag man and doing his dirty work, essentially. And Henry thinks when Theobald of Bec dies and the Archbishopric of Canterbury becomes free, Henry thinks, this is great. I'm going to get my guy into Canterbury, and it's going to be wonderful. Then there is nothing going to be stopping me from doing just as I like. So he gets Becket installed as Archbishop of Canterbury. But there's one problem with this that Henry had not foreseen. something, call it, the Holy Ghost or the Spirit of Reform or whatever you like, had come upon Becket sometime in the intervening years. And Becket turned from a party-hardy dude who was the king's man into an ascetic. It's said that he started wearing a hair shirt. Who knows? But anyway, the Becket that Henry appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury was in no way his man anymore. Immediately, Becket started to try to carve out a sort of empire within an empire for himself. They rubbed up against each other very uncomfortably for a number of years. Their relationship got sort of increasingly fraught, and to go through all of those machinations would take about 10 hours. So I'm going to sort of skip to the good bits. All right. Henry and Becket had been in sort of intermittent conflict for a few years before Henry decides to call all of the bishops to Clarendon to talk about reforms that he wants to make to the church. So let's talk about the sort of, the Victorian reading of this. So the sort of the typical, A-level syllabus version of this goes, Henry decided, that not only the barons, but the church had gotten too much power or arrogated too much power to itself during the anarchy. So the church was taking advantage of the weakness of royal authority. And what Henry wanted to do is to restore the law, to restore the rule of law as it had been observed during the reign of Henry I. And on this view of history, the primary goal of the constitutions of Clarendon, so basically the sort of list of reforms that he presented to the bishops, was to deal with the controversial issue of, criminous clerks. So these are basically clergy who had been accused of committing a serious secular crime, but by benefit of clergy were tried in ecclesiastical courts instead. That's the sort of, the Lady Bird book reading of the constitutions of Clarendon. Okay, but what was actually going on? Right, it's important to remember that unlike royal courts, ecclesiastical courts of the time were limited in what punishments they could enact for a convicted felon. So the spilling of blood was prohibited. So if you had a priest, for example, who had committed a murder, the priest would be defrocked, essentially, and kicked out of the church, but he would not be murdered, or he would not be killed, as a punishment for murdering someone else. Whereas if he had been a lay person, if the same criminal had been a lay person, then he, in all likelihood, would have been judicially executed for the crime of murder. So on the surface, there is a difference in treatment between, clergy who commit crimes and lay people who commit crimes. Fine, but the point that the bishops made is that Henry's proposed solution was sort of more, it made the legal situation worse, essentially, because what Henry proposed was that rather than having clergy tried simply in an ecclesiastical court, they would instead, their case would be recognized by the king's court. The clergyman would be sent to the ecclesiastical court, the ecclesiastical court would defrock or degrade, as it's sort of formally known, the clergyman, and then the clergyman would be handed back to the king's court to be punished again. So essentially, clergymen were to be tried twice in two courts for the same crime. And as the bishops pointed out, this did not make everyone equal under the law. This actually made sort of clergymen worse off under the law for having been tried two times in two different courts for the exact same crime. So Thomas Becket resisted for all he was worth these constitutions, but was it precisely because he wanted to get his fellow clergymen off the hook for crimes? I don't think so. So if you take a look at the actual sort of history, the written records, the sources of the time, it's again a little bit more complicated than that. So the controversy over the constitutions of Clarendon starts long before that meeting. So it actually starts the year before, in 1163, when Henry summons all of his bishops to Westminster to hear his complaints about the governance of the English Church. The bishops didn't agree with the king, but then Henry decided on the gambit of asking them if they would agree in principle to observe the ancient customs of England. What does that actually mean? They weren't written down. Henry was asking the bishops to assent to something that they could neither see nor read. The bishop said, of course we will uphold the ancient customs of England where these do not conflict with canon law. Over the next year, and it was literally a year, both sides, so both the bishops and Henry, maneuvered to sort of gain advantage. Now, when I say the bishops and Henry, that's actually a bit of a misnomer, because the king was himself advised by a bishop, Arnold of Lisieux. The bishops were advised by laymen. So the two parties to this conflict do not neatly break down into church versus state. It's church and state versus church and state on both sides. It's very important to keep that in mind. Henry saw that he was not going to be able to ram these changes through easily. And so he petitioned the Pope, who by this time was Alexander III. Becket and his party also sent letters to the Pope, but they also sent feelers out to the King of France and to the Holy Roman Emperor. So again, church and state versus church and state on each side. The Pope refuses to take sides in this conflict. Why? Because the Pope was still under threat by the Holy Roman Emperor. These wars, these sort of conflicts were still going on. And so what he needed was the political and, more importantly, the military backing of the biggest, baddest guy in town against the enemy that was on his doorstep. So while he wasn't willing to repudiate Becket, he also wasn't willing to antagonize Henry. So what the Pope does at this point is, he sends out a legate, which is basically a diplomatic negotiator for the Pope, and tried to sort of smooth this over. Becket, seeing that things weren't really going his way, began to sort of put feelers out. Okay, if I have to go, into exile on the continent, where do I go? This came to a head when Henry summoned his barons, as well as the bishops, to Clarendon for a council. Now, it's important to remember, Becket was a fighter, and so was Henry. They were both as bad as each other. They both had amazing, enormous personal magnetism. Both were able to convince anyone of anything they wanted them to do. Both of them would not give one little inch in anything that they wanted. Unstoppable force in Henry meets immovable object in Becket. The meeting at Clarendon didn't go very well. The king said, okay, I need you as bishops to assent to uphold the customary usages and laws of the realm of England. This sounds, pretty good, but they were very hesitant because, of course, nothing had been written down. They were being asked to agree to something that they didn't know what it was. Henry wanted a blank check. Henry got his blank check by threats, arguments, bullying them. It would be very, sad if your ecclesiastical revenues would be cut off, stuff like that. The bishop signed his blank check, and the king then sent off a sort of committee of barons and clerks to compile these kind of putative customs into a written document, which was to be presented to the council. They come back with this document. In the middle of it's being read out, Becket says, no, stop. These are not the ancient customs and usages of England. You're trying to sneak in a whole bunch of stuff that we don't like. Becket says, look, we're going to postpone. We're going to go talk with the canon lawyers, etc. Henry wouldn't have it. And so eventually, even Becket, he didn't seal the document, but the bishops essentially had to capitulate. This meeting left a very bad taste in Becket's mouth. So a few months later, in August, Becket says, never mind all of this stuff. I'm sick of this whole thing. I am going to go to France. This is, of course, against the constitutions that he had supposedly agreed to. Becket gets caught going to France, and he is hauled before a council on essentially trumped up charges, because Henry cannot be bothered at this point to deal with the guy who used to be his best friend, was supposed to be his man, and now he had betrayed him. So he hauls Becket up before the court, which finds him not guilty on some of the charges, guilty on others. Becket, who had been hauled before this court, refused to accept the sentence, so he fled Northampton, where the court was taking place, and he took sanctuary. And eventually he sort of gets away and gets to France. Now, the next thing that happens, all of this happens very slowly. And this is something that's not often realized. It wasn't Henry gets mad, he spends 4 nights to kill Becket immediately. No, this was a 6-year-long conflict. Thomas Becket is in France. Henry, he's between France and England. Both of them refer the case to the Pope. The Pope sends out legate after legate, envoy after envoy to try to defuse the conflict between Becket and his archbishop. What was happening in the church in England during this time? Well, Becket's exile was great for Henry in a way, because he didn't have to deal with him. Becket's exile was even better for the Bishop of London, Bishop Gilbert, because he got to sort of step into Becket's shoes, and he became advisor and counselor to the king. So neither Henry nor Bishop Gilbert of London really had any desire to give in, to rehabilitate Becket, because he wasn't actually causing them any trouble in exile in France. So they sort of engaged with the Pope's process in a rather sort of desultory way. Becket, seeing that he had sort of been outmaneuvered, decides that he is going to force the issue. So this issue has been running for 2 years, and in spring 1166, Becket decides he is going to force the issue. So what does he do? Now he has certain powers as archbishop, and he begins to threaten Henry with ecclesiastical punishments. He threatens to excommunicate people, and he starts excommunicating people. In 1166, he starts by excommunicating a number of Henry's advisors and clerical servants, and this is a big problem. Excommunication is not a small deal. Excommunication, you can no longer take part in any of the sacraments offered by the church, including last rites. So if you die while you're excommunicate, you're going downstairs. And that's a problem for these people. Henry takes the bait, and Bishop Gilbert takes the bait. They convene a council that meets in London. They send letters to the Pope, to Becket, appealing against these excommunications. The Pope receives these letters, and he must have been so exasperated by this point, because he writes to Henry saying, do nothing, don't take the bait. He writes to Becket saying, stop excommunicating people, you moron. Becket doesn't listen. Alexander sends more legates and tries for the next 4 years to try to resolve this dispute. Becket keeps turning up the pressure by excommunicating more and more and more people. Finally, Henry says, you know what? I'm going to get him back good. Now, Henry offered the papal legates a sort of compromise on some of the constitutions of Clarendon, which Becket didn't like. Henry agreed with this. The papal legates agreed with this. When the papal legates get to Becket, Becket says, nope, screw this guy, basically. I am not negotiating with this guy anymore at this point. Oh, and by the way, you papal legate, you don't have power to do anything to me, so, go and sit and etc. This becomes an impossible, as much of an impasse as it had been at before, when Becket finally throws his last toy out of the pram and says, I will not negotiate with the king, and I will not accept any papal legates as any judges of any case against me. Henry decides to take matters into his own hands. So what does he do? He has a son, an heir, Henry, later called Henry the Young King. And he decides that he is going to crown his eldest son and heir co-king. Now, there's only one problem with that, which is that the only person who has the authority to anoint, to consecrate kings in England is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Henry thinks, oh, I got him good. So what happens is he gets the Archbishop of York, with or without the assistance, it's not quite clear, of the Bishop of London, to consecrate Henry, the young king, as co-king of England. Becket hits the roof. He excommunicates the Bishop of London. He excommunicates a number of other clerics. And by this point, you have, several of the leading bishops in England, including the Archbishop of York, who have been excommunicated by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket is stuck in to his position. Henry is stuck into his position, and it's the anarchy. Nobody is going anywhere, and there seems to be no possibility of ever negotiating the way out of this. Henry gets so frustrated after hearing of these excommunications that he snaps. And he doesn't say, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" because that was an invention of a later historian. It's about 1740, I think, that was first written down. But he says something like, what has become of my realm when such sort of ingrates flourish in it? And off the back of this, supposedly, 4 of his knights decide that they are going to go and end this 6-year-long ecclesiastical versus royal dick swinging competition, excuse my French, by doing Becket in. So Becket, he had returned from exile in France. He was in Canterbury Cathedral. The monks were chanting Vespers when one of them comes puffing up the stairs to say, "Archbishop, there are a number of armed men who are prowling around outside the cathedral. What do we do?" Becket says, "Well, leave the door open. I'll come down and meet them." So he does. He goes downstairs and out into the cathedral. The knights burst in, and one of them cries something like, "Where is Thomas Becket, the traitor?" Thomas Becket says, "I'm no traitor, but I am perfectly willing to die if it is my time." There's bandying about of words, and there are a number of contemporary chronicles, including one by an eyewitness that I've sent you a link to in the email, that talks about this in all its gory detail. Becket falls under sort of a rain of sword blows, but I think the sort of the most gory detail that comes out of the chronicle is that these knights had also brought a cleric with them. And it's the cleric who, after the knights cut off the top of Becket's head, goes over to Becket and uses the toe of his sandal to sort of spread Becket's brains over the floor. And he turns and he says the immortal words, "We can go, lads, this one's not getting up anymore." And indeed, he didn't get up anymore. All right, so Becket's dead. He's lying on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. He is interred by the monks, because remember, Canterbury Cathedral was a monastery as well as the cathedral at that point. He's interred, and there's huge fallout. Henry immediately disclaims anything to do with the murder. He says that Thomas had been murdered by excommunicates and others from England, but he's in huge diplomatic trouble. Louis VII of France, who had, of course, never liked Henry anyway, because, Henry cuckolded him, and also had taken over a large number of his territories. Louis is agitating against him. The Holy Roman Emperor is agitating against him. Nobody thought that Henry was innocent. And so Henry, after 3 years, remember, Henry was a fighter. Henry was stubborn, and it took him 3 years before he was willing to do penance for this murder. It ended very poorly for Henry, not only because he had to do penance, but because his sons and his wife, including Henry the young king, rose up in rebellion against him. And many contemporary commentators thought that this was God's punishment for Henry's reluctance to do penance for the murder of Becket. Okay, so we've got to the point where Henry, in his shirt, is doing penance in front of the not very elaborate yet tomb of Becket. This had huge consequences beyond just the rebellion that ensued. But in a way, interestingly enough, they were rather delayed. So it should be clear, I hope, that this was not, that the conflict between Henry and Thomas Becket was not as simple as a church faction versus a state faction over the rule of law. It was messy, it was complicated. Henry and Becket were both as bad as each other, and it was essentially, it was personal animus and not so much the rule of law that motivated all of this. All right, we'll park Becket for a minute and talk a little bit about the sort of the fallout. So by the late 12th century, so this is, by the time that Thomas Becket was murdered, papal reasoning had sort of extended the idea of their power of the keys beyond the normal bishop's powers of excommunication, penance, purgatory, and had started exercising control over a number of subordinate offices of the Roman Church. Now, how was this actually promulgated? Well, the idea was that, Pope Leo I, sort of patristic author, was talking about, the plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power that popes have, saying that papal authority and dignity included both temporal and spiritual power. So the Two Swords Doctrine, and this is important because we'll come back to this, the Two Swords Doctrine, as it was known, came to mean that the Pope possessed both swords, so the temporal sword, the power of the state, and the spiritual sword, the ecclesiastical powers. The Two Swords Doctrine came to mean that the Pope possessed sort of both swords, the power to act in both the secular and the sacred realms, but that the Pope granted temporal powers to rulers. So any king who ruled, through essentially the condescension of the Pope, rather than it being sort of sacral kingship whose power came directly from God. Now, this was one of the things that Thomas Becket and Henry II had argued over. This was one of the things that the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor had fought a war with each other over. But it was only about sort of 32 years after Becket that finally this doctrine gets codified in a papal bull called Unam Sanctum, which is issued in 1302. And it was probably the most egregious example of Pyrrhic papal overreach in the entire Middle Ages. And believe me, there are a lot of those. Now, why do we call it the Two Swords Doctrine? Well, it's motivated biblical exegesis, right? Because you remember when Jesus tells the disciples, he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. And the disciples say, Lord, behold, here are two swords. And Jesus says to them, okay, that's enough. This gets turned into two swords are enough. Obviously, it's the sacred and the secular one. And, Peter, right? Jesus says, on my rock, I will build this church. And he obviously has. Motivated biblical exegesis never gets you anywhere. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is making the argument between Henry II and Thomas Becket into an argument over a doctrine which was only sort of promulgated 32 years later. It's a little bit of a misnomer. How do you actually get to that? Well, we're going to come back to that in the last session, because the cult of Thomas Becket has a huge, long-lasting afterlife. Obviously, it's Becket that all of Chaucer's pilgrims are going to see in the Canterbury Tales. There is a huge sort of cult site of Becket in London. Remember, he was a local boy made good. There was, the cult of Becket was huge, not only in England, but actually throughout Europe and even in the Middle East, as anyone will know if you've recently gone to the British Museum's Becket exhibit. But Becket came to symbolize essentially not necessarily the independence of the church, but the idea that even the kings had sort of limits on their authority and on their power. And this is why when you get to Henry VIII literally has Becket expunged from history. I mean that literally. He issues a decree saying that Becket must be scraped from the membranes of the missal, so his feast day must no longer be remembered, and any sort of missals containing the service for the feast of the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket have to be expunged. So in a way, the story that I've just told you has a lot more resonance later on in the Middle Ages than it actually does at his time. Yes, there was an outcry. Yes, Becket was canonized 3 years after his death. And he was, his cult was enormously important in England. It sustained a huge pilgrimage and tourism industry. But for the political and social implications, you have to wait until, the 1530s or so. And we'll come on to that in the last session. But I hope at least that I have sort of helped to set the record straight, and happy to do questions. All right. Yes, Martin makes the point about sort of double jeopardy in the CDM process that we have today, and other sort of processes. Yes, that's true. And actually, it's quite interesting if you read the article by Rowan Williams that I sent as a sort of attachment to the email. Rowan Williams talks about that. Becket still has some really interesting modern implications for the modern Church of England. So I do recommend reading that. Roger says, did the conflict between the two men take place totally over the heads of the common people? Well, the answer is, what do you mean by the common people? If you mean sort of the peasants, no, it didn't take place over their heads. And the reason why is that at one point, Becket threatened to put the entire kingdom of England under interdict. What is interdict? It's essentially excommunicating the entire country, saying that no church services, no sacraments, no nothing can take place in the entire kingdom of England. Becket threatens to do this if Henry doesn't capitulate to what he wants. And this is, of course, a huge problem. Becket is trying to foment rebellion, is trying to foment anger and resentment against the king, because it would have been terrifying for anyone to be outside the sacramental assurance of the church. So anyone in England who died under an interdict, if it happened, would have gone straight downstairs. And so interdict was sort of the ultimate kind of weapon against a king. So Becket threatened that. He actually didn't place England under interdict, thank goodness. But he certainly threatened it at one point, and people were aware of this, and Becket made sure that they were aware. This was brinksmanship on both of their parts. Let's see, Claire says, did Becket's death make European bishops less outspoken? Interesting. It depends. So, for example, if you look at, say, the Holy Roman Empire, where you have, prince bishops, for example, that are ruling various sorts of cities, they had their own sort of temporal as well as spiritual power, and they could essentially say what they liked. In a way, it's sort of emboldened some of them. You have a number of sort of tracts that are written at this point about, the church has XYZ sorts of powers. You have the Pope that, as I said, tries to arrogate more power to himself by promulgating this bull and whatnot. So in a way, it emboldened people against the secular arm for quite a while, although the secular arm, as we will talk about in the next but one session, the secular arm gets its revenge within 100 years or so after Becket. Let's see, Robert says, did Becket actively seek martyrdom? No, that's an interesting one. I mean, both of them, if you read the chronicles, everyone who's talking about both Becket and Henry says they were single-minded, they were ruthless, they were shrewd and intelligent, they were not willing to back down or give an inch. So do I think that Becket actively sought martyrdom? Not necessarily. I don't think that he necessarily did, although he must have been aware. And he was aware from a decade and more of very intimate service with him. Becket was quite aware who he was dealing with. And he was very aware of Henry's temper and the fact that Henry would not back down. So he must have known that it was quite dangerous to resist. Did he actually, actively think, I'm going to get some people to, kill me? I doubt that he did. But of course, we don't know because, we don't have, anything that Becket is sort of, writing down about this conflict, sadly. It would be nice to have the sort of, the diaries of Becket and of Henry, dear diary, this Thomas guy, etc., etc. These sort of things that you want from the historical record that you just don't get, sadly. I mean, this is a huge, here we go. How much actual source material do we have from Becket? Now it's interesting. So we have some of his letters that are remaining. Some of them are still in the archives in Rome. And I think that the link that I gave you to the Internet History Sourcebook has a couple of those. So we do have some stuff from Becket that remains. I mean, it's mostly, he's writing in a sort of high style, right? Because he's trying to sort of make the case with these letters. You don't really have you don't have anything that is not meant to be a sort of grandstanding official document, sadly. But if you want to know sort of, who Becket was a bit more intimately, I like the chronicle account written by Edward Grimm, who was Becket's crucifer, who was actually sort of injured trying to keep the knights away from Becket. He writes a very sort of startling account of, what he calls the martyrdom. But that, I think, gives you quite some insight into Becket's character that, his letters themselves don't necessarily give. All right. Yes, and also used as the source for T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. Yes, absolutely. And that's sadly something that I didn't have time to mention. There's so much more stuff with, Becket and his cult, and, we could go on for about 2 or 3 hours, but I don't want to tax your patience too much. So unless anybody has any other questions, to sort of leave it there at 1 hour. I think, you know, the sort of the version at the church last night, I think we went 1 hour and 20 with all the questions and stuff like that, but I will not make you sit on Zoom for that long. Right. Thanks, folks. It was lovely having you. Now, I should say, before you all go, we're not meeting next week because it's half term. So not next week, but the week after is the next one of these. And we're going to be talking about medieval piety. And it's really interesting. People keep saying, well, how much did individual people actually believe? What did they believe? How do we know what they thought, felt, did? We're going to talk about all of that. And it's going to be fascinating, I hope. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time for that. Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.